Hello and welcome to another session on literary criticism and theory. We will begin with lyrical ballads. We'll begin the essay section and we'll begin with lyrical ballads by William Wordsworth. Preface to the lyrical ballads, not lyrical ballads, preface to the lyrical ballads by William Wordsworth. But before we move on to the preface, to the lyrical ballads, we should have an understanding of the age prior to this period, because the lyrical ballads, with the publication of lyrical ballads in 1798, the romantic revival or the romantic revolt or romanticism, the period of romanticism kickstarts. So, in order to understand as to why lyrical ballads became a kind of romantic revolt or a revolt against the neoclassical period, you should have an understanding of the neoclassical period. That is the 18th century to be precise. Well, this begins with the middle of 17th century. About the middle of the 17th century, change had come over the spirit of English literature. This change is no simple change or a mere fluctuation of literary fashion. It is deeply rooted in the life of the time. The age of Renaissance was that of spiritualism and material expansion. Remember, this is the 17th century. Loyalty to Queen Elizabeth, that is, though Queen Elizabeth, or after the succession of King James the Sixth, that is James the First of England, Elizabeth, in fact, was still a very important figure. In fact, even now, to this very day, she is a very important figure. Queen Elizabeth I was, in fact, a very important figure when it comes to England or Britain. So, loyalty to Elizabeth became an article of faith. They took pride and delight in their country's past and also the new religious creed, the Anglican Church. But this was in the 16th and the first half of the 17th century. The Elizabethan period, that is, to be precise, the 16th century, the Elizabethan period. But this emotional fervor was too high-pitched to last. Imagination and romanticism had begun to degenerate to extravagance and violence in the early 17th century. The lofty and high idealism of the Elizabethan poetry soon degenerated, and a new type of interest was taking over in the closing years of the Elizabethan age. Writers like Bacon and Milton reflected in their writings this new style. Politically and also in the civic life, you will find this as the theme of poetry. That is, politics and civic life or civil life became the theme of poetry, not imagination, not romanticism that existed in the Elizabethan period. Now, the main reason to this is Charles I's execution, and then you have the Commonwealth period, and after that comes the Restoration. So the main reason to this is the Restoration. Restoration brought in this change. Okay, and you can see that this change affected not only the politics of the state, but also in literature, science, art, in fact, every aspect of England or every aspect of Britain was affected. Well, the Renaissance or the 16th century did bring the classical fervor to England, and the writings of the classicists continued, but it became more, it inspired, their inspiration became more evident, more in the 17th century writers. The classical fervor. The writings of the classicists, that is Aristotle, Plato, the Greco-Roman period, the writers of the Greco-Roman period, Longinus, Virgil, Horace, all of them. They became, or they got inspired. It did inspire, or the Renaissance brought, of course you have studied Renaissance in the in methodology of literature, we discussed that in detail, so I don't have to tell you what Renaissance is and how it shaped England. So here in the 16th century and the Renaissance period, it revived the Greek Roman classical writers, that it greatly inspired the European countries, especially England. But in the 17th century, their spirit or the inspiration, this sort of inspiration became more. The wild speculative interests and imaginative fervor of the Renaissance, however, was thrown away. And this gave place to the practical application of these ideals to actual life. The nature of life was given more importance. In the Renaissance, if imagination and speculative interests were given importance, in the 17th century, slowly it was all to do with practical side of life. It was about how they portrayed actual life as such. And so, naturally enough, literature itself became involved with the problems of practical politics of the day, the civic life of the day. As I said, the triumph of classical ideal was again a natural result of the Renaissance. The romantic spirit of the Renaissance had been aroused because of the study of Greek and Roman classics. But to the 17th century writers, or say the 18th century, the Augustan age, it was the method of writing of these classical or old writers that attracted their attention. It was all about how to write, the rules and regulations set by these classical writers that attracted their attention. Whereas in the Renaissance, it was all about the way they dealt, or the way they imagined things. Wild imagination, and the way their imagination was given more importance. So they took the imaginative side, whereas the 17th century writers, they took the writings, the method of writing poetry, how to write poetry. It was all about how to write poetry. Remember these two words, okay? How to write and what to write. Because in the neoclassical period, you have how to write poetry. How should one write poem or prose or whatever. And in the romantic period, you have what to write. So in neoclassical period is how, in the romantic period is what. That's why Wordsworth says it's a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotion. So it is all about what to write. Okay, what to write, the theme is given more importance. Whereas in the neoclassical period, it was not what, they were not concerned with what to write, they were not concerned with a theme, they were concerned with how to write. Of course, theme was given importance, but it was all about human nature. They were also interested in nature, but it was not the nature as of Wordsworth's nature, but the human nature that was given more importance here. Thus, in the 18th century, classicism was fostered and encouraged by the political need of the age. Not just this, much of Charles II's exile had been in France. Okay, you do remember that, right? The Restoration period, and the period before that, the Charles I, his father Charles I was the first king to be executed by the Parliament. Charged of high treason, and he was executed, remember? And Oliver Cromwell comes to power, Commonwealth period, and then after that, after the death of Oliver Cromwell, the Parliament decides to restore monarchy, and Charles II is brought back. So during the period, once Charles I was executed, his son Charles II and his family, they fled to France, and they were exiled, or they lived in exile in France. And therefore he was greatly influenced by French classicism, and he did his best to enforce, when he came back, when he was restored to power, when monarchy was restored, Charles II enforced all these ideals he saw there into English literature. He was an ardent fan of French classicism. So that's also one reason for this new change. So remember, we are dealing with Neoclassical period, okay. Only after that we can go to Romantic period, because unless you understand the period as to why Wordsworth is revolting, why this new change is being brought up, you will not be able to appreciate, you won't have any idea of why Wordsworth has taken such a pain to write a preface to the Lyrical Ballads. Lyrical Ballads was published in 1798, and preface was added in 1800, okay, 2 years later. Psychologically, the new spirit, that is this neoclassical spirit, involved substitution of the critical for the imaginative spirit. So another thing that I want you to bear in mind is Wordsworth's period, that is the Romantic Revolt or the Romantic Revival, is the second phase, okay. The Elizabethan poetry or the Renaissance and the Elizabethan period can be considered as the first wave of Romanticism. It is, however, not called the Romantic period, but it is referred to as the Renaissance or the Elizabethan period, and not referred to as Romantic at all, but it had all the features of Romanticism in it. Okay, so that is what this new period, when the neoclassicists, when they came, they replaced the imaginative spirit that was there during the Elizabethan period. Okay, so you are dealing with the Elizabethan period, means the first wave of Romanticism. Romanticism of the 19th century is actually the second wave. Okay. Thus, literature became the vehicle of attacking political life of the day in the neoclassicists or the neoclassical period or the Augustan period or the age of enlightenment, the age of sensibility, whatever you call it. In this period, during this period, literature became the vehicle of attacking political life of the day. So the creative imagination moves on to the plane of primal human qualities and human nature. It was to attack human nature. It was an attack on politics of the day. It was an attack on the civil life of the day, the civic life of the day. Okay, and imagination, the creative imagination was thrown out. It was more practical side of life, the human nature. Okay, thus the spirit of neoclassical period was that of critical and analytic and not creative or sympathetic like that in the Elizabethan period. That is the 16th century, the period after, or the period during and after the Renaissance. It brings the intellect, it gives more importance to the intellect rather than the poetic imagination. Okay, intelligence, the intellect was given more importance, the rules of writing poetry, the the theme was all about important human nature. Okay, and it had nothing to do with imagination. Their principal object was to avoid, again, extravagance and emotionalism. Now, why is it so that they revolted against this imagination? See, Elizabethan poetry was very, it was good during the first few half, like for instance, after Shakespeare perhaps, after Bacon, after Milton, there are few, it started to decline. The poets of the Romantic period, the later Romantic period or the later Elizabethan period started using, again this was the problem, that is degeneration. They started using words, too much of extravagance of emotion, and very much little to do with, they were playing with words and words. It was all too wordy, too imaginative, too illogical things started to come up. And that is the reason why this period began to decline and the new spirit started to come up. So they were trying to control the way of writing poetry. Poets of the late half of the Elizabethan period never wrote poetry. They started writing, they started using their own meter, they're creating their own meter, creating their own style, they experimented on words and too much of imagination and too much of extravagance, which eventually led to the decline, and the neoclassicists were trying to bring an order to this kind of chaos that existed or that came during the late half of the Elizabethan period. Okay, so it's like a peak. Everything has its highs and ups and downs. The period, the Elizabethan period started high, but when it reached the peak, it started to decline. Likewise, you will find the same thing in the Neoclassical period also. When it started, it reached heights from Dryden to Pope. It reached its heights with Pope, and then it started to decline with Samuel Johnson. Samuel Johnson was an important poet, was a great poet, but after Samuel Johnson it started to decline. So the same thing you can see, the same graph you can see in Neoclassical period also. So here the neoclassicists, they were trying to avoid extravagance and emotionalism, unwanted emotionalism. Thus, during the neoclassical period, poetry starved of emotional sustenance. Okay. It had no emotion. Emotion was not given importance. And so to sum up, the aspects of the change were substitution of classicism for romanticism. We have the political aspect, that is the influence of France through Charles II and his restoration. We have the psychological aspect, which was more than the more than the change of fashion. It was a change of attitude. It was not a change of fashion of the way literature was presented in everything. It was not just in literature alone. It was, you can see it in science, you can see it in arts, you can see it in their attitude. Okay, so it was you can in their dressings. So it was all a change of attitude. Okay, another important aspect is the general drift of the age towards matters of civil and national interests. That was another important aspect where politics began to play an important part of one's life. Thus, the new school of poetry, which began in the 17th century, had its vogue. It spanned the whole of 18th century and was called the Augustan or neoclassical poetry. So this was the age, or this age was a reaction to the degenerated and monstrous extravagance of the later Elizabethan writers. Okay, so it was like an attack on them. Thus, the features of Augustan poetry again can be summed up as absence of any sense of mystery or awe. When do you have mystery and awe? Awe is wonder. When you have imagination, right? So, in their view, in the view of the neoclassical writers, in their attitude towards religion, in their view towards life, in their view towards philosophical problems, the English Augustan poets displayed an absence of any sense of mystery or awe. Their watchwords were respectability and decent conformity. Conformity to what? Conformity to rules of how to write. Okay? They shunned or they gave away, they threw boundless imagination, they shunned boundless imagination or any super sensuous world. They hated all such enthusiasm. So imagination was driven out. Okay, and also anything to do with the super sensuous world was also thrown away. All right, so that is the first important point of Augustan poetry. Absence of any sense of mystery or awe, which means imagination, no imagination at all. No mystery, no awe or wonder. Okay. Emphasis was on form and not subject matter. Originality of thought was less important. That is the theme, that was the content of the theme was not important. For them it was all to do with the perfection of expression. How to write, your word should be perfect. In the words of Pope, if you are to quote Pope, quote, true wit is nature to advantage dressed, what oft was thought but ne'er so well expressed, unquote. Okay, so it was all to do with it was all to do with form. As you studied in formalism, it was all to do with the form of writing. How well you can express your thoughts using the right word, the right rhythm, the right way, and confirming it to the rules set by the classicist. So it was all, emphasis was on form of writing poetry or writing whatever it was, prose or anything. It was all to do with the rules or the form, and subject matter was not important. The content was not important. Okay, so that is the second important point. The third important point is they too followed nature. The neoclassicists also followed nature. The Augustans also believed that the business of poetry is to follow nature. But following nature, they meant exact reproduction of everyday life and manners as opposed to anything wild, extravagant or purely imaginary. Okay? It was not to do with the nature as of Wordsworth's nature, not the nature or the super sensuous world of Keats or S.T. Coleridge, and nothing to do with Spencer's imaginary world, nothing to do with Milton's imaginary world. So they shunned or they opposed anything that is wild, that is extravagant or purely imaginary. For them it was all about reproducing the everyday, the common life, the nature of human beings, the human nature. Okay, and they believed that the ancient writers has done this, and therefore to copy nature, they thought it was enough to copy the ancients, how they presented the human life. Okay, of course they had the classicists used a lot of imagination. They did not take that imagination, they did not use imagination from the classicists. They gave away imagination. They did not take imagination from them, but instead they took the form of writing, how they copied the nature of human life, the tragic fall, the flaws of heroes, and so on. Okay, and therefore you must remember that this age was only pseudo-classic. Pseudo? Fake, false. Okay, so it was not purely classic. This age was pseudo-classic. We do not find anything of spontaneity, of unconsciousness that is present in Greek literature. We won't find that here. Because as I told you, imagination, there was a lot of imagination in Greco-Roman period, in the writings of the ancients. But they shunned that. That aspect was not taken into consideration. They took only how to write poems, the rules that were set by them, and also what the theme. Their theme was to copy human nature. You will find that in Homer's Iliad, in Odysseus, in Oedipus, Sophocles' Oedipus. Okay, so it's all about the tragic life. So that means they are copying what? Human nature. So that's what they believed. Okay, English Augustan literature is highly self-conscious. That is conscious polishing. The words meant everything to them. We may call the age classical in its clearness of thought, in its clearness of expression, and above all, in its suppression of emotion. That you have to remember. Emotion is suppressed. In its restraint. So the suppressed emotion, see again, emotion, if you use a lot of emotion in your poetry, they consider that as a style of bad poetry. And what they did, they exalted reason. They confirmed the rules and conventions of writing, and not mere use of long words filled with emotion. They rejected that. They did not want long words filled with emotion. They rejected that. Okay, I hope you understood. Now very soon we will go to just the opposite. Wordsworth is going to revolt against all these things. Okay. Remember, each age you will find a decline of one age, and you will find a new age coming. Again, they will be revolting against the previous age. So don't think that whatever they say is the correct one. You have to, this is true and the other is wrong. No, this is all criticism. They are the critical philosophies set by a particular period or a particular set of writers or critics during a particular time, each with its weakness and its importance at the same time. Okay, all right, so I hope you understood that. And the next point is, they gave importance to town life. It was not the country life or the village life that was given importance. It was the supremacy of town life over country life. This was a very important feature of Augustan period or the Augustan poetry. See, in the Augustan period you will find scandals, you will find artificial fashions, the squabbles of metropolitan life, all this, how these poets and writers were making fun of the period, the human nature, the artificiality, the artificial fashion, the scandals all brought in, the squabbles of metropolitan life. Like you have satire, no? It was a period of satire, mock satires. So that is why we call this period also mock satire, and the form that they used was the heroic couplet. So you have mock, heroic, satire during this period. Okay, so supremacy of town life over country life. Now if you look at Dryden, an important poet of the new school of poetry of this 17th century, that is the beginning of the Augustan period, not completely, of the middle half of 17th century, and by 18th century we have Alexander Pope, and the closing of this you will find in Samuel Johnson. They classified what makes good poetry and bad poetry. That's it for today. Thank you and keep safe.